Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the webinar today. We're very pleased to see you all, and I think some more people will be joining us shortly. This webinar is part of a research project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and it's looking at experiences of welfare reform among larger families. It's focusing on the benefit cap and the two-child limit. It's a partnership between the Universities of York and Oxford, as well as LSE and the Child Poverty Action Group. And we're very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for the funding, and of course also to the parents who are affected by these policies who are giving up their time for the project. All presentations today will be fairly short. I will make sure that that's the case, and there'll be time for questions. But it's important that you use the Q&A function in Zoom for your questions, please, if you could do that. You can put comments in the chat, but the panelists won't be replying to those comments. What we'll do is pick out some questions for the panelists from the question and answer function for them to answer, and then we can always follow up after the webinar if we're not able to answer all of them. We're recording this webinar, so we're assuming that you are happy with that if you continue, and we'll share that online afterwards. Do tweet about this using the hashtag larger families, and thank you so much for attending today and your interest in the topic. I expect many of you, if not all, will actually know about these policies, but just in case, the benefit cap was introduced in 2013, and it was lowered further in 2016, and it restricts or caps the amount of benefit that households with no one in work can get, with very limited exceptions. The two-child limit was introduced in 2017, and it restricts the social security benefits, not child benefit, importantly, to the first two children in the household if other children have been born after April 2017, with some exceptions, again, quite limited, multiple births conceived as a result of rape, and so on. So before the first speaker starts, I'm just going to ask Ruth to run one of two polls that we're going to run. I will explain you've got your mute and cameras off, most of you, but we hope that you'll take part in the poll that she's about to run before our first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran, and thanks everybody. So this is where I always get really nervous and think the technology is going to fail me, but I'm going to launch this poll now, and you've literally got 30 seconds to vote because we're very tight on time. So can some of the panelists nod? Can you see the poll?
Yeah.
Brill. So yeah. So just fastest fingers first. It's a bit like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and we'll we'll vote. Right, I'm going to end the poll there. So I'm sorry for those of you that didn't get to see it, but I'm going to get to it in time. But the correct answer, so actually we've got really good knowledge amongst the participants, because the correct answer is 73%, so which is the answer that most people kind of selected. So in polling for Ipsos Mori by Ipsos Mori for DWP in 2013, 73% supported the principles behind the benefit cap. So I'll stop sharing that now, but interesting to see the spread of what people put. Okay, back to you, Fran.
Ruth, and we should say that's Ruth Patrick from University of York. Okay, so Tracey Jensen is going to speak now. Dr. Tracey Jensen is Senior Lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies at Lancaster University, and she's the author of Parenting the Crisis, The Cultural Politics of Parents' Blame, published by Policy Press. She's going to be talking about anti-welfare common sense and some of the narratives that underpin policies such as the two-child limit and the benefit cap. And she'll also look critically at the policing of some families and parents by the state. Thank you very much, Tracey.
Thanks very much. Can everyone, I know you have to say this at the beginning of every Zoom call, can everyone hear me? Okay. So thanks everyone for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be part of this discussion. So I'm interested in welfare, fertility, changing ideas about family and parenting, and large families. And large families are defined as 3 or more children. We know from population data that families that are large are less than 1 in 10 families. In the UK, people are having their first child later, and if they do have children, they're having fewer children, and a greater number of households are not having children at all. And yet there remains this social and cultural fascination with large families. The image on this first slide is taken from a feature in the Sun newspaper, which was published last year, which profiles some of the world's biggest families, or at least those that have a media profile. So despite being in a minority, or perhaps because they're in a minority, large families are a receptacle for all kinds of fantasies. And we might think about how celebrity supermothers get sort of glamorized and fetishized. But large families can also become a receptacle for a range of resentments. And that's what I want to think about today. I promised to do quite a lot in 10 minutes. But what I really think about is the kind of cultural life of the pathologized or stigmatized large family, what I'm calling benefit broods. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to briefly outline some of the cultural narratives that underpin the two policies that we're discussing today, the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. So both of these policies are premised upon particular ideological ideas about welfare claimants and about the welfare system. And they kind of rely on and reproduce these really important ideas or myths about welfare benefits and about the people who claim them. And there's all sorts of different myths that get reproduced, but we might condense these into 3 key myths. The first one is that poverty is caused more by individual behaviour, choices, rather than structures or context. The second one is that the welfare state, as it stands, sort of traps people or creates dependency or ends up rewarding poor decisions or problem behaviours by removing the real possibility of destitution. And thirdly, that policymakers need to sort of retool or reform the welfare state so that it can change these behaviours. And the way that they've tended to do that is to reform welfare so that it's become more punitive around behaviours or choices which are seen as problematic. So welfare reform in practice has meant reorienting welfare towards punishment and sanction and away from sort of support or security. So there's a bigger decade of welfare reform that these two policies fit within, the bigger reform project, which is scaffolded by these kinds of mythologies. 4 decades of neoliberalism that these ideas sit within. And these interlocking myths have been used effectively to shrink the welfare state, to reduce and sometimes even completely withdraw entitlements for particular groups, but also to extend the capacity of the welfare state to monitor and sanction and enact surveillance and punish claimants, and particularly over the last 10 years of austerity. And probably lots of us in this particular event know these figures, and we know the ways that these restructurings and reductions have been affected. So the questions that I'm interested in are less to do with sort of policy technicality and more to do with consent. So how and why public consent for the broader welfare reform project has been so high, as is demonstrated in the poll that Ruth just ran. And more specifically, why these 2 policies in particular, the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, the brunt of which have been borne by large families, why those have been so crucial to getting public consent. So these interlocking ideas about welfare, we might call them sensibilities. If you wear a cultural studies hat and you're interested in culture and media and the ways that political ideas get socialised into everyday life through culture, you might call them structures of feeling if you're more sort of sociologically inclined, those historically specific forms of public consciousness. You might prefer a term like zeitgeist to refer to those sort of period specific cultural patterns and recurring symbolic structures. But it's really thinking about these ideas that get repeated and recirculated so that they become unquestionable, so that they come to need very little evidence, they come to feel ever more solid. In other words, they go without saying, so they need less and less in the way of evidence and data to support them. So the term that I've always preferred is common sense, a term that emerges out of British cultural studies, and it's a really useful term for thinking about how repetitions work to structure and organise forms of social knowledge, how they work to amplify particular perspectives, frame the limits of debate, and importantly how they work to build consensus for specific actions and interventions and policies. So the sensibilities, the structures of feeling, the common sense around the welfare state, and we might think of 40 years of neoliberalism, or more specifically 10 years of austerity policy, has been a period where an anti-welfare common sense has been made thinkable and then made solid through the circulation and repetition of specific ideas and figures and imaginaries. And I think a really important set of figures that have been used to circulate and repeat that anti-welfare common sense has been the idea of the benefit brood. So large families have been a crucial linchpin in the production of anti-welfare common sense, and in the generation of consensus and consent for welfare reform. So I've been really interested in how large families have been transformed into cultural objects, how they've been mediatized, how they've been crafted into units of stigma. And I've got some examples here on the slide, across sensationalist newspaper coverage, across web discussion forums, across reality television, and I'm really interested in reality television in particular, and across talk shows. And what I mean by this is that large families, of course, have lived experiences that are complex and rich and maybe contradictory, but that richness becomes flattened when they are crafted instead into cultural figures or symbols that can then be anchored to other signs. So we might think about the phrases and sound bites that the benefit brood is connected to, ideas of troubled families, intergenerational worklessness, welfare dependency, these kind of cultural scripts and cultural shorthands, which serve obviously a powerful ideological and political purpose. So I've been really interested in how large families, and often the same large families, become mediatized, how they become transformed into these figures of stigma, most notably the figure of the benefit brood. And it's often the same large families who travel across these different media sites. So a typical narrative arc might be that they feature on a documentary, or on a reality TV program, which then leads to an explosion of newspaper commentary, which then leads to an invite onto talk shows where those large families are invited to defend themselves. And they then enter this sort of pseudo celebrity circuit. So this is really an orchestration of disgust within a media ecosystem, which is organized around outrage. It's organized around clickbait and getting you to click forward and getting you to post an angry comment. So it's a very specific and corrosive part of anti-welfare common sense that leads into these complex anti-welfare imaginaries and these anti-welfare forms of common sense. So the benefit brood has become a kind of cultural figuration or shorthand that's been used to agitate and organise disgust towards families that are deemed to be excessively large as a result of allegedly overgenerous welfare benefits. So they're constructed as pathologically fertile, constructed as cynically exploiting the benefit system, addicted to welfare, addicted to having babies. So we can see how the repetition of these kinds of ideas serves to make solid or make common sense an anti-welfare common sense. So benefit broods come to operate as a technology of consent. They're used to orchestrate a consensus of disgust. So this is a consensus which is aimed towards these flattened, mediatized figures like benefit broods, but it's also a consensus of disgust towards bigger, more abstract ideas like the welfare state. So what's so powerful about this anti-welfare common sense is how effectively it amplifies and loops back on itself in a kind of feedback loop. So with each repetition, the common sense acquires more charge. The common sense comes to operate more in a way that means it goes without saying. It's anti-evidence, it's anti-curiosity in lots of ways, and some of the painstaking research on the devastating consequences of austerity and welfare reform, some of that myth-busting work which demonstrates how ungenerous the British welfare system is, or the small proportion of families who might actually fit the criteria of benefit broods. This research, this evidence, this myth-busting often fails to cut through that anti-welfare common sense because it operates at a much faster, much more visceral level. So it's kind of effectively powerful rather than intellectually persuasive or evidence-based. And anti-welfare common sense is powerful because it's framed and anchored within a broader context that's been named as authoritarian populism, unleashed first by Thatcher, and I know Chris will be speaking more about this in a moment, which emphasises law and order, personal responsibility, and most importantly, encourages resentments and corrosive divisions, and promises to coerce and police and punish those who are constructed as the kind of enemy within the cause of crisis. And if we think about the sort of flag-waving authoritarian dimensions of political discourse, we can see how powerful that promise to punish is. So one thing to notice about the shape of this anti-welfare common sense is that these forms of public consciousness, these sensibilities about welfare, are never final, they're never complete. They're always a site of struggle and contestation. And what I'm interested in at the moment is the ways in which this common sense has been punctured somewhat during the pandemic, as more of us started to experience the realities of the welfare state, as we started to acquire a more perhaps expansive sense of what the welfare state could be, with things like the furlough system, perhaps a greater recognition of our vulnerabilities and our collective responsibilities towards each other. We see this kind of growing counter narrative, which is perhaps challenging or puncturing, shifting and opening up some space within that anti-welfare common sense, which is something that I'm looking forward to hearing more about today. But I'll finish there, but I have to say, if you want to read more, you can have a look at I'll make these arguments in more, with more time in my book, and also in an article that I wrote about the benefit brood in particular. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That was really great as an introduction to today. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to people, please do put questions in the Q&A to Tracy, and of course to our future speakers as well. They won't be able to respond to you in the chat, but they certainly will, we hope, to the questions in the Q&A. And I've got a first one for Tracy, which is from Gemma Schwendel. And she's asking particularly about the media. So who is driving the stigmatization that you've talked about within the media?
That's a really, really good question. And I think I would say one of the important things to recognize about this orchestration is that it comes from many different sites. I mean, there's a temptation to think that this just comes from right-wing media, or this just comes from particular media commentators or TV producers, but actually I think what we see when we look at the spectrum of anti-welfare common sense is that it comes from all sorts of places, and it comes from all sorts of sites within the media ecosystem. And actually, one of the complicated things about common sense is that you can have contradictory ideas circulating around welfare at the same moment, and that's what makes it so interesting. One of the things I always have to remind myself is that the media doesn't tell us what to think, but it does tell us what to think about. And so I think that idea that they're kind of framing the terms of the debate around welfare, so perhaps not telling us that we have to think this about welfare, but very much limiting the terms of the debate around welfare. So there's certain things, certain ideas that are really central to the welfare state and to thinking critically about welfare, which are just not present anywhere across the media ecosystem, partly because it won't bring attention, it won't bring clicks, and the media ecosystem, particularly today, is overwhelmingly driven by attention. It's an attention economy. So who is driving it? I mean, that's a really good question. It's a very complicated question. But one thing that I would say is that it's not coming from one part of the media ecosystem. I think it's coming from many, many parts.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That's great. And I have another question for you, which is from Sonia Michael. What do you think about some of the beliefs that this is primarily to reduce benefits for households which have typically had more than 3 or more than 2 children? For example, Muslim or other immigrant households. How important is that as a driver, do you think?
I guess, do you mean in terms of how that gets, I think that is how that gets used as a way of legitimating anti-welfare common sense. I think that is certainly an important part of it. I think there is a really interesting racializing dimension to anti-welfare common sense. So a lot of the research that I've done has been on reality television, and particularly a genre which has become known as poverty porn television. And one of the really interesting subgenres within that has been television that's looked at racialized populations. So there was one example of a poverty porn sort of franchise series which was called On Benefits and Proud. And one of the most successful spin-offs that was produced was around sort of gypsies on Benefits and Proud. And that was a very sort of racialized and racializing program which orchestrated disgust not just towards people who are claiming benefits, but particularly gypsies who are claiming benefits. So I think that there is a really interesting racialized dimension that can be overlaid across a lot of this anti-welfare common sense. I think that's a really important question, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And the next one is from Harriet Plows. Would you say that the discourse is all top-down, or that politicians and the media are driven and constrained by what people already think? And actually, an anonymous attendee has also said, who benefits from the stigmatization, which perhaps you could link to that third question as well.
Those are both really good questions. I think this idea of sort of top down and bottom up, for me, what's interesting about public opinion is, and this is with my sort of cultural studies hat on, we often think of public opinion as kind of organic and spontaneous. And this is just what the people or the public think. And I think what's interesting when you start to think about anti-welfare common sense as a machinery that's put into action by many different actors is you start to see that public opinion is editorialized, it's structured into being, it's orchestrated in particular ways. And that's not to say that the public are told what to think, but the idea of public opinion being spontaneous or being organic or somehow emerging from the grassroots up is quite a problematic idea. And particularly when you start to think about this as a machinery that's based on repetition and recycling, you start to see that that idea of public opinion as organic becomes really hard to hold on to. So I would say, I don't think the discourse is top down, but I also don't think the discourse is bottom up either. I think it's a complex orchestration involving many different actors, many of whom are policymakers, of course. And that question about who benefits, I mean, that's a really big question. Who benefits? Well, the current government benefit, I guess. And I think what's interesting for me is that in terms of who benefits from the stigmatization of welfare claimants, it's certainly not people who rely on the welfare state, right? It's people who want to undermine and dismantle the welfare state. Those are the people who benefit from the undermining of welfare.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And just the last one, they say, if you have time, the best line of attack to change the narrative about Social Security recipients. This person, Oliver Crunden, agrees that myth busting alone may be insufficient, but is keen to hear your thoughts on more emotive strategies, perhaps, that might be more effective. You haven't got that long, but and it's a big question, I know, but any ideas he would be pleased to hear, and so would the rest of us.
Well, I think, I mean, obviously I can't I can't solve all that in 30 seconds, but I think for me, and me and Ruth have talked about this a lot, for me, the biggest strategy is to generate and incubate a pro-welfare common sense. So it's about, for me, the most valuable thing that we can do is to find ways of generating solidarity and that sense of collectiveness, that sense of collective responsibility towards one another. And that means developing a more expansive set of ideas about what welfare is. I think one of the most effective things that's been done in terms of anti-welfare common sense has been to talk about welfare as if it's something that just a minority of people benefit from, and to narrow down the idea of what welfare is. And I think what we need to do is be more expansive in the language that we use around welfare, and to say, you know, welfare is not just about unemployment benefits, it's also about pensions, it's about education, it's about healthcare. We need to shout from the roofs that the NHS is a socialist welfare experiment. It's an incredibly successful one. So it's about being more expansive in our welfare imaginaries, so that more people feel that they have a stake in it and that they're part of it, and that and recognising that they benefit from it as well. So it's kind of drawing more people in and generating that sense of solidarity and collective responsibility.
Thank you very much, Tracey. There are some more questions coming through, I'm sure. Please keep them coming through, including to our next speaker, but please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat. That would be really helpful for us all. Thanks a lot to everybody. I'm going to introduce Dr. Chris Grover now, who's the next speaker. So Chris is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University as well. And this year he published the Household Benefit Cap, Understanding the Restriction of Benefit Income in Britain in the Journal of Social Policy. He's going to explore a previous attempt to introduce a cap to benefits when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and he'll reflect on why the politics shifted to make a cap politically possible under the coalition government. And we'll also consider whether COVID-19, as we've already discussed, might represent the opportunity for a shift in public attitudes towards social security. Thank you very much, Chris.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran, and thanks very much to Ruth for inviting me to talk today. And thanks also to Tracey for setting things up so well. As Fran said, I too am from the sociology department at Lancaster, although I am a policy analyst, which kind of demonstrates the broadness, I guess, of the department. So I'm going to be talking today about kind of an exercise that took place quickly after, or soon after, the election of the first Thatcher government in 1979, which was to examine the possibility of restricting benefit income for people in what was then described variously, but one of the labels that was attached to it was the benefit limit, and this is kind of part of a broader set of interests that I have in kind of the relationships between social security, social assistance in particular, and kind of issues around wage labour and the incentives to do wage labour. The paper's available via the Journal of Social Policy, but unfortunately it's hidden away there behind a paywall. There's a pre-published version that you can access via Lancaster University's website. Just some kind of general observations to start off with, and I guess the first one is that kind of restricting benefit income is not unusual in Britain. I'm not saying that it's right, and I have lots of difficulties, as probably we all do, in using penury essentially to enforce wage labour, and that's essentially what the restriction of benefits does. It uses poverty as a means of creating what the states and governments of various persuasions describe as work incentives. So we can kind of point to poor relief and wages. The payment of poor relief was often adjusted to local wages, for example, and then there was the wage stop that was in existence between 1935 and 1979, where outside of exceptional circumstances, benefit income for unemployed people could be restricted to what they could expect to earn in work. And at its peak in the 1960s, it was affecting sort of between 15 and 20% of households receiving unemployment assistance. So not an insubstantial proportion of people. And those were informed essentially by principles of the 1834 Poor Law Commission report. Its focus upon less eligibility, the idea that people who are not in work should not be kind of as well off or as comfortable as people who are in work. They should be less eligible, and also the idea that relief should not be paid to people in full-time work. That was also a principle of the 1834 Poor Law Commission report. The idea there essentially is that if relief can't be paid to people in paid work, it would then seem to be perverse to pay people who are out of work more than they might be earning when they were in work. And both of those principles are probably still more influential than many of us would like to admit in social security provision, particularly the notion of less eligibility. So as I kind of started with, the benefit limit was discussed early in the first Thatcher government. Geoffrey Howe, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was particularly keen he started out being particularly keen on the idea of restricting benefit income. And there's just a couple of quotes from him that kind of outline his ideas, which are essentially that what he perceived as a need to reinforce or to reimpose work incentives was one of the most pressing issues for social security policy. And the first kind of quote there for me is very kind of Benthamite in its tone: the inherent unattractiveness of working against not working and the need for substantial income differentials. The combination both encourages and provides an opportunity for a person to stay at home, operate as his own master, and forego the constraints and aggravation of taking of taking formal employment. So in addition to its kind of the gendered notion that men were breadwinners, is very much focusing upon the kind of the idea that people use benefits to flee the pain of work for the pleasure of leisure. And then he went on: the relative benefits a non-worker can receive compared with in-work incomes is contributing to the imbalance in our society, which lies behind much of our present economic troubles. And that included kind of falling GDP, but more specifically, the kind of focus there was upon stagflation, the idea of the observation of unemployment and wages increasing at the same time. And essentially Howe's argument, and the argument of the Treasury, was that benefit levels were fueling that, because firstly they disincentivised people to go to work, and secondly employers had to increase the wages they were willing to pay to incentivise people to take a job. Following reporting on three kind of potential benefit limits, so kind of three models, the idea was actually dropped. With an argument that it should be revisited, but it wasn't revisited. There were kind of new strategies for reinforcing work incentives, particularly around the idea of supplementing the wages of people when they're in low paid work. In contrast, of course, we have the household benefit cap that, as we've kind of heard, it was announced in 2010, part of a desire to save £18 billion a year through cutting social protection, and then it was reduced in value, and that was announced in 2015 in the search for an additional £12 billion per year. So huge amounts of money removed from social protection, and particularly in the first kind of round of cuts, the household benefit cap actually made a very small contribution to that. It was estimated that it would save about £270 million a year, which in social security terms is really a very small amount. A really very small amount of money, and in some ways I think it shows the kind of symbolism of the of those kind of concerns that Tracey spoke about before. So just to kind of talk through some of the reasons why the benefit limit was rejected in the 1980s or 1980, and I guess in some ways this is kind of linked to the politics of social security. It's also linked to kind of concerns about the administration of social security as well. So firstly, that it was deemed to be a controversial step too far. Patrick Jenkin, who was then Secretary of State for Social Services, noted of the Social Security Acts, there were two in 1980, that no government has previously attempted to either remove benefit or to reduce their value, and we shall be doing both at once. And the kind of view, his view, was to, if in addition to that, there was an announcement that there would be a new benefit restriction, that actually might undermine the whole of that programme. So in some ways, the rejection was a defensive move to protect already agreed cuts in what Misha describes as the Great Welfare Chainsaw Massacre of 1980, which in the kind of context of Tracey's focus upon culture, I kind of quite like. It's kind of references to popular culture at the time. It was also, Jenkin also argued that it would be vocally opposed. It would offer a slogan to our critics. Did the Conservatives want to be branded as the party that reintroduced the detested wage stop? And once again, that was a very powerful argument. The wage stop was abolished about 5 years earlier. The kind of the detested nature of the wage stop that Jenkin is referring to there is kind of the ways in which it had been increasingly criticised from the late 1970s publicly, and also there were a whole set of concerns coming from staff who had to attempt to enforce the wage stop. Although there were kind of contradictions there, because those staff were also concerned about levels of benefits as well once the wage stop had been abolished. There was also, I think, a genuine concern with hardship, particularly coming from the Supplementary Benefits Commission and the Department of Health and Social Security. There was concern of its potential impact upon those households that were deemed to be large or upon large families. I think there was concern with that. There had always been concerns via the or about the administration of the wage stop, for example, in causing hardship. I mean, normally the kind of the distinction there were made between kind of hardship and severe hardship. Severe hardship was problematic into kind of wage stop terms, but hardship was seen to be acceptable. So there was, I think, some genuine concerns, kind of rooted in I guess kind of notions of social security, kind of protection for individuals and society. And also kind of linked to that, there was a concern it would create a demand for hardship payments. That was problematic because at the time, and this links to the next point, the government was also trying to reduce the numbers of civil servants, and the administration of kind of hardship payments is incredibly staff intensive. So it was deemed to be, there was a contradiction there in administrative terms. So kind of Howe's summary was that the options, the kind of options to restrict benefits would be attacked as unfair and discriminatory and would require additional staff. Unfair because they would kind of the model that was favoured, which was actually very similar to the one that was introduced as the household benefit cap, would focus upon large families. And discriminatory because it would be deemed to be anti-family. But Howe was also concerned that actually limiting the benefits of a small number of households would not have the psychological effect in helping incentives across the board. So although he kind of noted the unfairness and discrimination, he actually suggested that there should be a broader approach, which should be around holding back inflationary increases in benefits, which actually there was some of in the 1980 Social Security Acts, and in particular holding back increases in the allowances for children, which I have to say was very strongly opposed by Patrick Jenkin. I didn't quite catch that, Fran. Okay, yeah, I'll finish on this slide. So what changed by 2010? Firstly, there have been administrative changes. Restrictions to benefit are much easier to deal with via digital systems. There was no wage stop effect. Restricting benefits was not detested, as we've seen earlier on. About 3/4 of the public supported the benefit cap, and there was initially support from the Parliamentary Labour Party as well. Concerns with hardship had been lost, I think, via those kind of cultural discourses and tropes and stereotypes that Tracey was talking about. And so concern with hardship is lost to kind of 30 years of critiques of benefits and recipients. And also, of course, linked to that, hardship provision with the abolition of the social fund had been made the responsibility of the local authorities, so that wasn't really a concern to central government. Then institutional change from this notion of social security to a focus upon work and behaviour, so from the Department of Health and Social Security, for example, to the Department for Work and Pensions, kind of symbolises that focus. It's not that there wasn't a concern about wage labour in the late 1970s. The whole kind of debate about the benefit limit demonstrates there was, but I think there'd been a shift kind of qualitatively by 2010 in all for working age people, almost a wholly kind of focused issue around paid work, losing that kind of concern with social security. And then I'll finish on this point, that in the logic of work being the best weapon against poverty, which of course is something that many political parties argue, then naturally the household benefit cap could be understood as an anti-poverty measure because it was designed to incentivise it. And that took place in that kind of shift from measuring poverty as a proportion of average income to focusing upon what was described by the coalition as the causes of poverty, the main one of which, of course, was unemployment. So I'll finish there, Fran. I don't mind kind of coming back to issues around COVID and benefit cap in any questions there might be.
I've just posed one, but then we might come back to the COVID and the benefit cap. There's one question here, concerns and growing evidence about the hardship caused by the 2000 and benefit cap don't appear to be creating opposition to these policies, unlike in the 1980s. What do you think has changed?
Well, I one of the things I think has changed is the kind of the general environment which Tracey spoke about. I mean, it's not the case there wasn't kind of anti-welfare discourse in the 1970s. The kind of the emergence of scroungophobia, for example, was visible. But I think there was still some support for that notion of social security. I think that's what's been lost between the kind of the late 70s. Early 80s and 2010. The focus is, as kind of Tracey said, the focus is almost wholly negative when social security is being talked about, and kind of it's incumbent upon us, I think, to kind of to think about those positive issues around social security, what it does for individuals and what it does for society.
Thanks very much, Chris. There's one here from Tom Royston, which takes us to an international comparison. So he says the UK two-child limit seems to be an international outlier, at least in Europe. Have you any thoughts on whether there are nationally specific social or cultural factors which may have generated this nationally specific policy outcome? Now that's about the two-child limit, but I think the benefit cap could be brought into that as well, if you'd like to do that.
Okay. I mean, I think history's important, and I do wonder whether or not other countries that did not have a poor law premised upon kind of particular principles, kind of what impact that has. I think that's a really important issue. The kind of the institutional continuity of a focus upon less eligibility in particular, which is really where kind of contemporary debates about the level of benefits come from. In many ways, the benefit cap is a contemporary expression of less eligibility. So I do wonder whether or not that's kind of one issue. I mean, I'm in terms of benefit restrictions. I mean, I think there are examples from overseas countries where benefit is restricted. For example, in national insurance payments to particular percentages of previously earned wages. So once again, in some ways, I'm not sure that restricting benefit income is as unusual as we might suspect it actually is, because many of those kind of concerns with insurance kind of related benefits are once again kind of rooted in kind of maintaining the incentive to do wage labour.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now there was a question about COVID. So the question was, how can we harness the improved attitudes towards welfare that came out of the early part of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, I think kind of going forward, that might be difficult. Although undoubtedly there was some kind of more positive kind of approaches to social security, but I'm not convinced in the long term that they will remain. I think I don't want to kind of be too negative about this, but this is a kind of a fundamental question which kind of relates to what is the role of social security in society, and for hundreds of years now, the kind of focus really, or one of the main focuses, has been upon work incentives. And I think, I mean, the COVID pandemic has not kind of altered that to any great extent. When you look, for example, at the comments made by government ministers, they still focus upon the importance of the benefit cap as being a work incentive measure. My view is what we need to do is to somehow break the kind of relationship between supporting people who are not in work and the incentive to go to work. I think that's where the kind of the effort needs to be made. Otherwise, we will slip back into. Well, I mean, in some ways, we haven't really got away. A £20 uplift to universal credit is great for great for households that received it, but it was a £20 uplift on the already inadequate benefits and for a temporary period, and also, of course, furlough, which was the main kind of form of state support related to employment, was very much kept separate to other provision. For me, that symbolically, that's really important because it emphasises difference and exceptionality to COVID rather than something that is going to be around for a long period of time.
Thanks Thanks very much, Chris. And just a quick one before we finish, which is from Ruth Lister. How important do you think the change in Labour's position on social security under New Labour was?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the concern with work incentives did not disappear. You know, kind of when you look at the discourse from New Labour around the importance of paid work and kind of, you know, not shirking in terms of using kind of compulsory measures to make people work. So the kind of that wasn't lost, but I think in some ways there was a different approach, which was very much focused upon increasing people's income when they were in work to maintain kind of work incentives. That's not to argue there weren't problems with that. I mean, the incomes of single people and childless couples, for example, were not in work, were particularly problematic. They didn't really kind of benefit, for example, from the uplift in out of work incomes for households that had children. But of course, they did kind of benefit from working tax credit and so on. So I don't think the principles, kind of that notion of kind of less eligibility or the desire to kind of keep differentials between people who are in and out of work disappeared. But there was a different way of managing that.
Thanks very much, Chris, and for your presentation as a whole. We'll move on now to the next one, which is by Mary Reeder and Kate Anderson. So Mary is a research officer at CASE, the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at LSE. She's previously worked at the Education Policy Institute, the Institute for Public Policy Research, and for a Member of Parliament. And Kate is a research associate at the Department for Social Policy and Social Work at the University of York. She recently completed her PhD, exploring mothers' experiences of the conditionality within universal credit. And both Mary and Kate are currently working on the Benefit Changes in Larger Families research programme that has organised this webinar, along with Aaron Reeves from my department in Oxford University, Kitty Stewart from LSE, and Ruth Patrick from the University of York. Mary and Kate are going to share early findings from the Benefit Changes in Larger Families project, which includes both quantitative analysis and qualitative longitudinal research with primary caregivers in larger families. Thanks very much. I think Mary's going first.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much for coming, and to Tracey and Chris for such brilliant presentations. They're certainly very hard acts to follow for me and Kate. So yeah, as Fran says, we are part of the Benefit Changes and Larger Families team. And we're going to be talking to you today about some of our early findings from our qualitative longitudinal research that we're doing as part of this project. And I just wanted to flag that some of the lovely illustrations in this presentation are by Cat 40. So first of all, I thought it would be helpful to just recap why the analytical focus on larger families in this project. We know that larger families have a disproportionate risk of poverty, and that's for two main reasons. Firstly, greater household needs, but also the constraints that come with having lots of children in terms of engaging in paid work. And as Kitty Stewart and colleagues have shown very recently, most of the rise in child poverty since 2012, astonishingly, has been exclusively driven among larger families. So they're obviously a really important group to look at. And of course, they've become the focus, they've become a really rhetorically important group in recent discourses about welfare and social security, as Tracey and Chris have so powerfully highlighted. And that kind of mobilization of anti-welfare common sense has led to two main policies, which are the focus of our project, which are, as stated already, the benefit cap and the 2-child limit. So despite the importance of all these changes that have happened recently, there are some really important gaps, we feel, in our understanding of these policies and in what's happened to larger families in recent years. So we are going to use a mixed methods research design in the project, and we're going to look at 3 main research questions that sort of tackle those gaps. So firstly, how the profile of poverty has been affected by these policies. And Kitty Stewart, for example, has just done a paper about the changing poverty risk of these families. And to do that, we're going to use large-scale survey data sets and quantitative analysis. Secondly, how are families experiencing and responding to this changing policy context? And this is where our qualitative longitudinal research, which is being led by Ruth and Kate, will be so useful, because we'll be able to walk alongside these families as they experience the policies and as the impacts play out in their everyday lives. And then finally, we're going to look at how the wider well-being of these families has been affected and harmed. We're going to do this using quantitative methods and large-scale data sets, but also make sure that it's informed by the QLR that we're doing, so it's informed by people's lived experiences. So in terms of where we are in the project, we've just started our first wave of qualitative longitudinal interviews. And the main aim of this work is to, as I said, sort of look at how larger families are experiencing and responding to these policies. So we're going to be following 44 larger families over a period of 18 months, and interviews will be conducted in Bradford and London. We're going to try and interview primary caregivers at 3 points in time over this period. And we initially hoped that we'd be able to do this face-to-face, of course, but due to COVID, we're currently doing it via virtual interviews on the phone or on Zoom. And in general, actually found that doing it on the phone has been really good in general, and lots of participants have highlighted that they felt more able to speak freely and openly over the phone. We've had some difficulties in terms of confusion over the policies and how they interact, which I think is an interesting finding in itself in terms of the complex apparatus of these policies. And we've also had some challenges with interpretation and participants who have English as an additional language. But we've conducted 11 interviews so far, and we've got many more to come. So I'm sure more challenges and insights will come. So far, 11 telephone interviews. 5 of these participants were affected just by the 2-child limit. 4 were affected by both the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, and just 2 were affected only by the benefit cap. In terms of the number of children in these families, mirroring the kind of larger population of larger families, most of them had just 3 or 4 children, but there was a bit of a spread. 6 of our participants were from London, 5 from Bradford. Most of the primary caregivers we spoke to were female, perhaps unsurprisingly, but we did have 1 male participant. And 7 of 11 were single parents and 4 were partnered. And then in terms of ethnicity, 6 identified as Black African, 3 as Bangladeshi, 1 as West Caribbean, and 1 as British Pakistani. So I'm now going to hand over to Kate, who's going to take you through the main findings that have emerged so far.
Thank you, Mary. So our first key finding is that all of the families are facing considerable financial difficulty as a result of these policies. Parents talk about difficulty paying for basics like food, clothes, furniture. For example, one participant, her daughter was sleeping on a mattress on the floor because the bed frame had broke and they couldn't afford to replace it. Other things included bills like rent, utilities. And one thing that came up quite a bit was leisure activities. You know, the parents said, we just can't afford to do things with our children. And at the times, this could also apply to free activities. So, for example, one mum, she said, I don't take my kids to the local park anymore. And this was because there was a shop on the way and she didn't like to have to keep saying to her kids, sorry, no, we can't go in, we can't afford to buy anything. So here are just 2 quotes from 2 of the participants. So one is, we couldn't buy shoes and we couldn't buy clothes. I've got my 3 boys, only top, no trousers, no shoes, nothing. Only top I got, each £12. I got 3 for 3 of them, and I have a spare like oldish trousers. They put it on. And another said, it's a struggle, like the nappies, wipes, baby food. Like, the government should be made aware that basically that's the situation that we're in. We're struggling to get kind of the most basic items. And as you can see from that comment and from the list too, it is very much the necessities that the parents are struggling to afford. And another thing is that those quotes are very representative because they really focus on meeting the children's needs. So often when we ask the parents about the impacts of these policies, they talked about their children's needs and how they could meet them. And similarly, when we asked what difference would having the capped money make, or what difference would having the extra child element of tax credits or universal credits, again, the parents said what we do with that money is use it to buy things for our children to meet those basic needs. And so this lack of money and inability to meet children's needs commonly led to depression and anxiety and stress. As one participant explained, it's just been really bad. It's just been really, really difficult. It's especially impacted my mental health. I wish I didn't have to worry financially, like, am I going to be able to put meals on my kids' table? And because the parents didn't have enough money to meet all of their children's needs, they had to make difficult decisions about which child's needs to meet. And this could lead to feelings of guilt and shame. So one mum said, as a mum, I feel bad because sometimes you cannot meet all the needs. You cannot because of the financial situation. And that kind of makes you feel bad. And sometimes we'd say, okay, let me get this one what they want. And the other one, she'd be like, oh, why has she got it? And why don't I have it? And as you can see from there, this policy is also causing some kind of tensions within families. And that's something we're looking at more. So another mum said, I have to choose, like, oh, it sounds awful. Like, if one kid has no undies and one kid doesn't have t-shirts, I'll choose the undie kid. I'd be like, well, you need undies this month. Sorry, kid without no t-shirts. Other people don't have to think about which kid they love the most that month. And this early finding really corresponds with evidence from quantitative research carried out earlier in the project, which found that the benefit cap increases the risk of mental ill health. So the participants adopted a huge range of strategies in order to try and manage these low benefit payments. So some of these were shopping at the cheapest supermarkets, buying second-hand, using free sites to source birthday presents and clothes, selling outgrown clothes, finding hand-me-downs, really carefully planning meals and using food banks. And of course, this was a lot of hard work and took a lot of time. And we know that larger families also already face high demands on their time and a lot of time pressure. So this then disproportionately is falling on larger families. And there are also questions here about how it could potentially undermine the aims of the policy to incentivise paid work and increase movement into paid work. Because actually, how would you have time to job search and prepare for work when you're so busy just trying to get by? But despite all this really hard work, ultimately, most of the participants said that they'd got into debt as a result of these policies. When I asked one of the participants if she'd had any advice or support from organisations managing her low payments, she replied, I know what to do. I mean, unless the organisations go around, changing what things cost. I shop from the most cheapest stores out there. I've tried to do all sorts, but it's just a hard situation right now. And it's just this sense of no matter how much hard work and budgeting and strategizing you do, at the end of the day, there just isn't enough money for these families and for them to meet their basic needs. So another key finding is that there was a mismatch between the policy rationale and the lived experiences of the participants. So one example is the justification of the 2-child limit. So the government has said that this policy ensures that families in receipt of benefits face the same financial choices about having children as those supporting themselves solely through work. Of course, that's paid work referred to there. But for many of our sample, conception often wasn't a choice. It was the result of contraception failures. It could be an unplanned pregnancy, relationship, or non-consensual conception. And while there are exemptions for domestic abuse and also non-consensual conception, the participants weren't receiving these. So in the case of the participant where it was non-consensual conception, she knew she could get an exemption and get that child element. But she explained to me that she hadn't tried to get it for 2 reasons. And one was she didn't want to have to go through the verification process. And the other was she was really concerned that this might show up in some paperwork at some point and her children might see it. And she really didn't want her children to, and particularly the youngest child, to ever find out the circumstances of that conception. So a further 2 participants were not receiving any benefits at the time of conception. And this relates to a long-standing criticism of the policy that you can't anticipate what's going to happen in the future. And you might have good financial circumstances, but that can really quickly change, and you obviously can't necessarily be aware of that or plan for that. So only
just a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you. So only 1 participant made the choice to have a 3rd child in the knowledge that they'd be affected by this policy, and that family said, we're not looking for that too more in the same way. We believe that in our community or in our background home, we don't think about that because, you know, we are Muslim. So of course, this family is looking at it in a very different way as to that the government is trying to promote here. So with these early findings, we're going to enlarge these and enlarge this picture of how families are experiencing and responding to the changes by recruiting more participants and, as Mary said, interviewing them 3 times. And this qualitative longitudinal research, well, will be going alongside families. It should enable us to explore whether the policies have the desired behavioural outcomes. For example, does it increase into paid work? Whether the impacts worsen over time, how families manage increased financial pressures over time. For example, using food banks and borrowing from friends and families, they might not be sustainable in the long term. So hopefully we'll find out what parents do when they run out of those options. And also it'll give us this bigger picture by enabling us to see how experiences and responses change as circumstances change. So thanks very much for listening, and we'll be putting more findings out there as we get them, so please look out for those.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was really fascinating. There's a couple of questions about the sample for your qualitative research, so I'll put those first. And then there's actually a statistical question, which I'll put after that, if that's all right. So the couple of questions about the sample. One was, I wonder whether families outside cities would have different experiences to your London and Bradford sample. And that prompted the question from the same person about why you chose to focus on London and Bradford. So that was a bit about the sample, but there's another question about the sample as well from Sonia Michael, which is, how did you recruit the sample? So just a little bit of information about the sample recruitment, if that's all right.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I suppose to start with, yes, I would imagine that if you lived in a rural area, you might have some different experiences and possibly different challenges. I suppose why those areas? Because they are quite diverse areas, and we know that this policy disproportionately affects different ethnic groups, and also those areas have quite a high concentration of poverty, and also, so, you know, therefore we're likely to find that people want to recruit there, and of course it enables a bit of comparison having the two. And then moving on to how we recruited, we've got links with people in the local authorities in the different areas, and so they've really been helpful in helping us both get out our information leaflets, but also identifying people who are subject to this policy.
Thank you very much. The question on data came in some time ago, but I don't know whether you two feel that you could answer it, or possibly one of the other speakers. It was about data and statistics in relation to the actual percentage of large families and their incomes. In other words, for example, the balance between employed and unemployed large families, and that possible disparity between that and what public perception or opinion about that is?
So I'm not able to offer specific numbers, but I know that certainly in terms of the recent increase in child poverty, one of the really interesting things is that it's been also the case for families in work, and it's been despite significant increases in work intensity among larger families over this period. So that hasn't helped prevent them from falling into poverty. And I think there certainly is this perception that the norm is being out of work for larger families, when in fact the main working pattern appears to be, well, the most popular working pattern for larger families is to have one parent full-time and one parent staying at home with the kids, because obviously cost of childcare, etc. It's sometimes economies of scale if one stays at home. But there are also lots of part-time and part-time configurations. And I think it's something like 1/3 of families are larger families, was the latest statistic that I heard.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm going to kind of merge this conversation to the general conversation, which we can have for a few more minutes as well. But one of them which does relate to your presentation was whether any of the families you felt had internalized the stigmatizing narrative that we heard about earlier on in the webinar today. So it's kind of linking the two parts together, or the three parts together, I should say. Whether they felt the impact of the stigmatizing narrative, whether you actually asked them about that as well, which I'm not sure we know about. So do you want to respond to that one?
Sure, I'd say we don't have a lot on that. But I think one thing that was noticeable was actually more of possibly a distancing to that narrative and a trying to resist it. This is just from what we've got so far. So we asked people if they thought that these policies were fair. And some people kind of bought into this, people have babies for benefits and are not trying to work and what have you. But then they'd kind of distance that themselves from it and say, but in my circumstances, it's fair because I didn't choose this.
Thank you very much. There's also a question which is coming at this from a different perspective, sorry, which is about the justice system and challenges in the Supreme Court. And it's from Grania McKeever. And she says, Chris's presentation underlines Tracey's point on fairness being accepted as anti-welfare common sense. This view of fairness has been challenged unsuccessfully in the Supreme Court, but it seems the attack on judicial review makes further challenges now. Should we include the legal system within a positive discourse on welfare? So this is taking us into the more general discussion to finish our session today. Anybody, either Mary or Kate, or indeed the other two, want to have a go at answering that one? Just put your hand up, because then it's easier for me to see you. Or indeed Ruth. Yeah, Chris.
I'm not sure I can kind of answer the technical kind of parts of that, but I absolutely kind of agree that there is a problem in people accessing legal justice because of, for example, the huge cuts to legal aid which have occurred over the past 10 years. So kind of people that previously would have been able to make challenges, I think are being prevented from doing that. So in that kind of context, I think that that kind of dimension of social welfare, the kind of focusing upon welfare rights in a very technical sense, is often overlooked actually in terms of debates around social welfare. And I think it would be good to include those that kind of area within these kind of much more, or what we need is much more kind of positive discourses around social welfare. But those kind of technical things around kind of challenging notions of fairness, I'm afraid I can't answer.
Thank you very much. I wanted to actually come on to fairness again as one of the general questions at the end. And we've actually had, I think, a comment and a question from Ruth Lister. One is that Tories justify policies using the rhetoric of fairness. How prevalent is that in the media as well, in that kind of discourse? And the second was a comment from her about whether we should be using social security rather than welfare as the way in which we talk about some of these questions. So would anybody, again, just put your hand up, would anybody like to tackle either or both of those? Yes, Tracey.
I mean, I think those are both really important questions. I guess I'd like to talk to the second one, because I think that's a really interesting question about the kind of language that we use. So, you know, in a way, the word welfare has become so sort of contaminated. And I completely understand why we might want to return or sort of resurrect other terms like security, social security. In a way, I think maybe part of the work is around decontamination, you know, and sort of finding more positive framings, or finding ways of talking about welfare that are inclusive, that help us see the expansiveness of what welfare does, and help us see the kind of universal, or nearly universal, reliance that we all have on the welfare state at some point in our lives. I think I can understand why we might want to just drop that term welfare altogether, but I think it's such an important part of the debate that I would prefer a more sort of decontamination approach than simply not using the word welfare again. But I think this is a really interesting set of debates around how language frames the possibilities, and how language, I mean, again, sort of thinking about culture and media and language, and thinking about how these things connect up with each other. It's so important, I think, to reflect on the ideological work of specific terms. They're not just empty vessels. They become loaded and they become charged with a whole history of, you know, a whole history of meanings that we, you know, we should be interrogating. So I think I haven't got a solution to that or an answer to that, but just to say that I think that's a really interesting set of debates, and my preference would be to decontaminate the word welfare than to just abandon it altogether.
Thank you. That could start a whole new debate for another 1.5 hours. However, we can't do that. I just wanted to come back to Mary and Kate, really, because I'm not sure I gave them sufficient fair time talking about fairness in terms of answering specific questions. So there's an interesting one here, which is, while of course affording basics is the priority for caregivers, have you or are you going to examine caregivers' feelings on not being able to afford leisure, broadly construed, activities for children? So, for example, hobbies, days out, encouraging their interests and so on. And this questioner is thinking of that in terms of the widening disparities between children in terms of social or cultural capital, as we might say, and the consequences that might have for children from larger families, both now and in the future.
So yeah, in our question guide, we had questions about various impacts, and leisure activities wasn't one of those questions. But because several people have brought that up as an issue and talked about how hard that is when you can't go, and of course, you know, COVID in some ways has helped because it meant that you can't do much anyway. But there's this feeling of when things do open up again, what reason do I give my kids? I can't now blame COVID and say, you know, oh well, we couldn't anyway. I'll have to say we can't afford it. And also this feeling of there's only so many free places you could go to, and then you've just done them on, you know them off by heart now. So basically, while we haven't started off with that, because it's coming out, that is something we're going to investigate more as it goes on. And yes, think about the significance of that, what it'll mean for children, you know, now and in the long term.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just pause at that stage, and just before we finish, we'll have a little bit more, but just to ask Ruth to do the second poll that she was going to do, to see what you all think about the next question she'll pose.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fran, and well done to everybody for sticking to time. It's amazing that we're on time. So I am going to try and find the poll, and then I need to try and find the second one. I'm going to do now, and then I'm going to launch it. So hopefully you can see it now on your screens. Can one of the panelists nod that they can see it? Can you see it? Okay, I'll give you a little bit more time because we're actually ahead of time now. So I'll give you 20 or so more seconds to vote for this one. We'll see where this gets us. And this kind of ties into things that Chris and Tracey were talking about how far the kind of pandemic context might actually puncture some of that anti-welfare common sense that Tracey was talking about earlier. Okay. You guys are thinking about this. It's a hard. I don't know if it's a hard one. I think it maybe is a harder one actually. I've got like 82% of you have voted. Some of you might have gone away and made like a sandwich on the side while you're listening. So I'm going to end it now, and I'm going to share the results for that one. So really interesting. I think this is really interesting, and this is drawing on polling by BPAS that was done late last year. And again, you guys are really well informed because you've chosen the right answer, which is that 61% were supporting the suspension or abolition of the two-child limit. And we really chose these polls deliberately because obviously that's ending on quite a positive possibility, isn't it, that actually has the public mood shifted, and is there now support for the suspension or abolition of the two-child limit? So I'll end that, but thanks to you all for voting. Back to you, Fran.
Ruth, we have various questions coming in about the future structure of the social security system as a whole. I am not going to pose those, given that we could go on forever, but just one more just quick one about the study we've just been hearing about, which is how much did your respondents talk about how things were before the benefit cap and two-child limit, if that applied to them? In other words, did they already experience some of the issues they talked about before the reforms? Did you ask them about that indeed?
So some of them did. We tried to ask kind of generally what it's like being on benefits, and also we had the specific questions about what difference would the money make, just to try and disentangle some of these effects. Because actually that is a challenge of the study, is that there's a bigger picture there. Obviously people are having deductions and things from universal credit, for example, which obviously then plays a part as to what you can afford. But yes, some people did talk about the before and after, and they said kind of the things that they could afford. And I think that helped people to answer the question of what would you afford if you had the benefit cap, because it wasn't just the kind of imaginary, this is what I think I would do, that could kind of actually be based in what they did do before they had the cap. And again, you know, it just made a huge difference to those basics. And in terms of the two-child limits, again, there were kind of comments along the lines, you know, before we had the element for, we had two children, we had the child element for each. And then once the third came along, we're trying to stretch those two elements between three children, and these are some of the problems it causes.
Yeah, and just to add to that, also some of our participants had entered the benefit system very recently, and since these policies had been implemented. So for them, their experience of benefits was synonymous with their experience of these policies. So I think Kate's right, it's going to be a really interesting thing trying to sort of disentangle the general welfare reforms and the experience of being on benefits from the specific impacts of these policies. But I'm sure more will come out that as we progress with the research.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm actually going to stop there. We did say that if there were questions that weren't able to be answered, we would try to follow up afterwards. So we will try to do that. We've got the questions recorded there if you put them in the Q&A. We've also got comments in the chat, which were really helpful as well, and information in the chat, which we can also share afterwards. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. It's been just a brilliant set of questions, I think, from participants, showing how they were focusing throughout the 1.5 hours, which is amazing, and how they were engaged with the issues that we've actually been talking about. But also that's, of course, very much thanks to our speakers. In order on my screen, Kate, Tracy, Mary and Chris, thank you so much for very good presentations, which also kept to time. I also want to thank Ruth Patrick, who was organising this whole thing incredibly efficiently and kept in touch with all of us. And also the person you didn't see in the background, who's Sophie Howes from the Child Poverty Action Group. And the Child Poverty Action Group is trying to help this project by helping it with communication and engagement, such as this webinar. And Sophie also helped me to manage the questions, without which I could not have done that at all. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you to all those attending. I do hope it's been as useful for you as it certainly has been for me. Thank you.
And just to say, like, just a last word, as we wave, that we'll make a few people were asking about the recording. We were recording and we'll make it available. And also I'll be asking all the speakers about the slides. And a last thanks to Nuffield Foundation for making the webinar possible. So yeah, thank you. Bye, everybody.